Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Diana Royce, Managing Director and COO of AllerGen NC Inc., the Allergy, Genes, and Environment Network, which is hosted at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario. I'm pleased to extend a very warm welcome to each of the 70 registrants participating in today's webinar. So welcome, everyone. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's presenters, Brett Finlay and Mary Claire Arrieta. Brett Finlay is Peter Wall Distinguished Professor and a professor in the Michael Smith Laboratories in Microbiology and Immunology and in Biochemistry and Molecular Biology at the University of British Columbia. He's co-founder of a number of biotech companies and founding director and senior fellow of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research's program in humans and the microbiome. He's a world leader in understanding how microbes cause disease and in understanding the role of the microbiota in human health and in developing new tools for fighting infections. He's been studying microbes for over 30 years and has published over 450 articles. He's an officer of the Order of British Columbia and of the Order of Canada, the highest civilian recognition for a Canadian. Mary Claire Arrieta trained in the Finlay lab at UBC and is now assistant professor in the departments of physiology and pharmacology and pediatrics at the University of Calgary. She's been studying intestinal microbiology and immunology for the past 10 years. Brett and Mary Claire collaborated with others on a breakthrough study in the Finlay lab in 2015 that connected asthma risk in infants to the absence of key intestinal bacterial species, a finding that attracted international media attention. They also co-authored the book, Let Them Eat Dirt, published in September 2016, in which they made cutting-edge science accessible to parents about the importance of exposing children to microbes in order to give them a healthier start in life. Brett and Mary Claire have kindly offered to share with us today what they've learned, to their experiences in communicating their research to the media and in writing about science for the general public. We look forward to their insights and advice. Welcome, Brett and Mary Claire, and take it away.
Thank you.
Thanks, Diane. So welcome all, this is Brett, and when we're asked to do this, I think we thought it would be fun because Claire and I are at different points of our scientific career, and yet we've been on this journey together. So what the plan is today is we don't have a huge presentation. We thought we wanted to keep it simple and really encourage questions. So initially I'll start out and discuss the concept of developing your scientific message that you'd like to get across. And then also one of the most common ways is dealing with the press. So we'll talk about how you work with the media on getting your message out. And then Claire will do social media and spearhead the discussion on do you really want to write a book or not, which has been a very interesting journey. And then we'll close up with how we actually translate the message to affect change in society. So I'm going to start with the scientific message because that's where it all begins, and this has to be a very compelling message, and if you're going to really try and broadcast it, it really does need to appeal to people. So you have to think a lot about how you're going to craft it and what that message is going to be. It definitely needs to be a progression in our knowledge, ideally a larger leap. And you need to think a lot about this, that, why should people want to know this? Is there any reason, what can it improve their life eventually, et cetera, and how that might actually work. So the other thing is that you don't want to oversell yourself, and you see it many times. Someone discovers a gene and the headlines are a new cure for whatever that disease the gene causes is underway. The press do a magnificent job of extrapolating everything, and it's tricky to balance that. They are going to do this, but I think you still need to put the science forward based on what it is. A big key is explaining why this message is really important to the world. Why should people care? Why does the person on the street, should they need to know about this? So you have to uncouple what you're excited about scientifically as a really neat little finding that, that is scientifically very fun, to something that actually might mean something to the average person. Because you got to remember that most people are not scientists, and if you're going to try and convince them they should pay attention to this, you need a compelling message. And then another thing you have to think about, and what you're going to get asked about a lot, is that you may have a terrific idea, but if it's going to take billions of dollars to implement, it's just never going to happen. So you have to, have seen the path forward and have sort of mapped that out to generally, how this is actually going to come to the average person. How could it affect their lives and what it's going to take to get there. So you spend a lot of time crafting this message out, and it's not just reading the title of the paper that that you've published. It's really, crafting it to something that the average person can understand. So once you've got your message together, then you need to get that message out, and one of the most obvious ways is talking to the press. So maybe we go to the next slide. So once you have a message, the most obvious way is you go to the press. This is by far the biggest way to disseminate information, or at least it used to be until social media came along. And this plays a major part in your message. And I think between Claire and I, we've done, I don't know, several hundred, 200-300 interviews. There's at least a couple of hundred on our Amazon work, and then similar numbers on the book. So you are going to be busy when you do this. But again, so you take that message, and it's got to be concise. You can't take 15 minutes to explain to the average person what it means. Ideally, one-liner, one-sentence type thing. Why? What is the message? So that necessitates it has to be fairly simple. You can't be complex. You can't use complex scientific jargon. We all realize as scientists it's coming from a very complex, finding, but somehow that has to be distilled into analogies and language that everyone knows. So ideally, you can provide examples that the average person can comprehend, and you can use language that it doesn't require a specialist, and that's really important. You see many scientists, they call it a big press release, and then they read the title of their paper and the abstract that they published, and people are sort of, huh, and that just doesn't go anywhere with the press. You should be very enthusiastic about this. If you're not enthusiastic about your work, no one else is going to be. So, but the trick is, of course, and one of my biggest problems, they get too excited and you start to speak fast, and, and nerves play a role too if you're in front of national TV, etc. So you want to pace yourself and, moderate that. I've always found it's good to be on good terms with the reporter. They will smile and nod at you as you're talking. Whether they understand you or not is another story, but try and develop a rapport with them, and that's actually important because they will come back to you, if you are a good interviewee, and they will use you, and that's important in the future. Sometimes you're absolutely gobsmacked by how silly a question might actually seem if this is supposedly a science reporter. Remember that these people are covering many different things, and they come from many different backgrounds, many of them from the arts, and so they're not scientists. So a good way to handle that is to twist that around to then actually bring it back to your message and get you back on track. Some interviewers will have their own agenda, and you need to push back on that politely, but really try and get it central to the message you're trying to get across. Now, what you can't do is ask to see everything before it always goes out, for accuracy. But I find that most reporters are quite willing to send you a draft as long as you just say you're going to check it for accuracy. You're not going to edit it. You can't change much of the wording. You have to realize they're going to go with what they've written. But I think as a scientist, it's always good to check for the accuracy and make sure that what they're saying is scientifically accurate, because we've certainly found that things can get really twisted and they can say things that aren't scientifically accurate, and it's your job to then ideally catch that before it goes out. And then the other thing to realize is that it's always an adventure, and they see things differently, and sometimes they will call a headline, they'll talk about a killer virus when they're talking about a bacterium, and so you have to realize this is part of dealing with it. But another thing that aren't on the slide, just a helpful hint, is that each university has a public affairs office. These people are terrific for getting the word out, and if you are thinking of getting a message out, they're certainly terrific people to line things up. They can line up interviews, TV, radio, etc., and do all that. And then the final thing is that if it is a big press release, you need to book some time off. It's going to be absolutely crazily busy, and these reporters are under tight time deadlines, and you're going to be talking to them at all hours of the day and night. I mean, I think Claire and I have done interviews everyone from 4 a.m. till midnight type thing, because there are different time zones in the world, and it's going to come fast and furious if the word gets out, and you are going to be kept very busy in doing that. So with that, I think so that's sort of generally talking to the press. I think I'll turn it over to Claire. She can take over with social media.
Thanks, Brett, and welcome everyone. Like Brett was saying, I think that the neat thing about pairing me and Brett here is the fact that I bring a very different perspective for someone a lot more junior than he is, and someone just starting to get used to the activities of knowledge translation to the public. So I wanted to talk about just talking to the people. Brett was saying the importance and different messages around talking to the press, but that may not happen for of course the different studies that the people are involved in, simply because not all studies make it to that level, and also because talking to people in general help you polish that that message that you want to carry. We should definitely do it. I think scientists carry an important message, and society in general may be lacking that message that we carry and our point of view on different issues. So I think the first thing is to practice, and I cannot stress enough how important it is to practice your concept, especially when you're like me, when you're just starting this, and it may be your first few times carrying your message with the general public and outside of our comfort zone, which is, conferences and talking to our peers at work. So how do you do that? I mean, you can definitely do it with your peers at work, but many of them are not going to tell you that you're using jargon, simply because that just becomes part of your lexicon. But practice with non-scientists. This is really important. In my case, I am married to a non-scientist, so I try to do that. But I definitely encourage people to do it. People that are non-scientists. Now, public talks, if you can arrange for one, are a great avenue. There's museums, there's science centers, even schools that would literally jump at the opportunity for you to go and talk about something that you think would be interest. And it would be a great opportunity for you as well to really bring down the language. And it's actually terribly hard at the beginning when one is used to speaking at a very scientific level. So I think this is a great way of doing that. But I think nowadays nothing works better than using social media. And I plug here Twitter, Facebook, and Reddit, but there's definitely more avenues of doing that. And it can be done for, with your personal account, just to encourage a discussion with your with your contacts that you already have. But I definitely encourage, if you have a topic that you think would be of interest to the public, and your work or someone else's work is important to include there, to generate a topic-specific page, if it's Facebook, or account for Twitter, or a topic in Reddit, to engage people that way. It's super useful. You get points of views that you were not counting on, and right now is the best, and I think that the best way and the more efficient way to get your message around. And I think some of the points that Brett was making earlier about being careful with your message and not to extrapolate it and not necessarily to get terribly excited, they're equally important here as well. Now, another way that you can transmit this message is to write a book. Now, should you write a book? I remember this was some of the things that Brett and I talked about when we looked at the possibility. We thought, first of all, we have an interesting message. At that point, I knew a lot of mom and dads of young children, and I had practiced my message with them, and most of them said, you know what, yeah, I think there's interest. So yeah, write a book, maybe talk about it. Do you have an audience? Make sure that you think that there's enough people there that would be interested in this. The second huge one is, do you have the time? Writing a book, and I'll explain a little bit in the next slide about the process of writing a book, but this is an extremely consuming process. In the case of Brett, he took a sabbatical pretty much to write this, just because of how long it took. In my case, I pretty much didn't sleep for 4 or 5 months to do that. So it's an extremely time-consuming process. Will you make money? The short answer is no, unless you're extremely lucky. Even people that write marvelous, brilliant books, they do not make money out of it. I think it's more of a lottery than anything else. So you shouldn't be doing it for the economic benefit. But importantly, if you are thinking about writing a book, because we just went through this process, we thought it would be useful to explain how publishing happens. We didn't know from the very beginning. So you started with an idea, and again, do you think it's good? Have you tried it out, and have you exposed other people to your idea? Do they think that it is a great idea? And importantly, you should practice this message with someone that has written a book before, which is something that we did, not necessarily a science book, but it was a law professor that had written a successful book before. And he explained how this works. The first thing that you do when you think, okay, I have a good enough message, is that you write a chapter. You write your best chapter, usually an introductory chapter, something that is going to summarize your main message, and you do it in the most eloquent way possible. And you take the time to do this right, because it is with this first summary or chapter that you're going to try and get a literary agent. And we didn't know that, these people existed before until we tried this. But the way this works, in most cases, good literary agents do not receive unreferenced or do not receive proposals or a chapter from anyone. You usually have to be recommended by either another agent or by someone that has written a book before. So it's kind of tricky, and that's why you should contact someone that has written a book before. And then after that, this agent or group of agents is really going to coach you through the process of writing a book proposal. And a book proposal needs to be really, really published, and it's pretty much a document where you're asking different publishing companies to do that, to publish you. And you have to be very compelling. It will not only include the chapter that you wrote, that of course the agent would have helped you to improve, but everything from a small market study, just to convince them that you think this book would be popular enough to be published. And it's really important to dedicate the time to write a really good proposal. And then it's where the waiting game starts. You wait for the literary agents to do their job. And literally this process actually happens in a very similar way that it has happened for decades. Many of these agents would actually travel to literary hubs like New York and London to talk with other agents from publishing companies to try and sell your idea. So this takes weeks or months, or if you're lucky, maybe less than that. And then hopefully you get one or more publishing companies that are interested in you. And after that, you sell a publishing contract. Sign a publishing contract. And this process takes a few months from start to finish, and then that is when you start writing your book. I mean, this is the classic way of publishing a book in the current publishing environment. There's other people that self-publish. We were strongly encouraged not to do that because it's hard enough to be successful when you have a professional publishing company behind you. It would be almost impossible to become successful when you self-publish, although it has happened in very rare occasions. So this is, A to Z, how it is to publish a book. And after you're done, after months of doing the writing, then the book becomes public, and you hope that it's well received after that. It is, of course, a great way to carry a message, because you know that people will contact you to do interviews, to talk about your topic. If you have a book, you'll be able to say, I want to talk about this book, and book a public talk. But of course, it all depends on whether you have a pretty strong message and that you can convince a company to be behind you for publishing. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Brett, who is going to wrap this up.
Okay, so yeah, thanks, Claire. That's a nice summary of the various ways you can start to get your message out. But the question is, why are you getting message out? Well, the idea is you actually want to cause a change in how society functions, ideally, and you want to improve society. And this is where I think over the years I've found this very remarkably difficult and extremely complex. Yes, you may have the best invention since whatever, but getting it adopted to use is actually very, very difficult. And I think as scientists, this is what we fight all the time. We may have what we feel is the solution, but even if you have the solution, getting it into practice is extremely difficult. something I was involved in many years ago was developing a cow vaccine for E. coli 0157. Cows carry it. They contaminate the environment through hamburger and water, and then kids get sick. And we basically developed a successful vaccine that worked very nicely in cows. There was no such thing out there, and I thought we were done. And little did I realize that no, indeed. For example, the farmers wanted nothing to do with it because they say, well, 0157 doesn't cause disease in cows. It's a kid's disease. And then the FDA and the USDA for 3 years fought over who should actually regulate it because it was an animal vaccine for a human disease. They couldn't figure that out. And the food irradiators said, well, we already have a solution. We can irradiate food. And ironically, it was about a 20-year process, and I hate to say it, but at the end of it, it was unsuccessful, even though we showed that if you vaccinate every cow in Canada, you would save $200 million in healthcare costs, not counting deaths and everything. So it's very complex, and there's many things that you never even dream of as a scientist being involved in it. The other trick is that you're going to have to enlist a lot of help, and from policy people, for example, and governments, et cetera, et cetera. And just to give you one example, the CFAR program I'm involved in, what has happened is medical schools are now taking microbiology out of the medical school curriculum in North America. And so we're trying to say, well, can we actually change this? Because we now realize how important microbiology is, microbiome, et cetera. And so, we're, meeting with all the deans of medical schools. We're looking at all sorts of different ways of enacting this change. And it's taking a phenomenal amount of work, and I honestly don't know if it'll be successful or not, but we think it's important. So often you need a policy change, and this is the trick with getting a policy change is to say a change in government policy or change in corporate policy is you got to find the people that actually make these changes, and that's your foot in the door to actually convincing them this actually needs to be done. You will need to work with governments at all levels and agencies at all levels. So municipal, provincial, and federal governments all need to be in the loop. And what you rapidly realize is that each of these don't talk to each other, and even within the government, Health Canada doesn't talk to Agriculture Canada, et cetera. And there's these different silos, and you're going to have to somehow get them all united and working together. Now, a major reason why you've done all this get your message out work previously is that it really helps if people have already heard this message. And this really, really, resonates. If they hear it again, they realize this is actually, oh yeah, I heard something on the news the other day about this. And I think that all the news that's going on with microbiomes these days, I mean, that has certainly increased the willingness of various people to actually sit down and think about it and listen about potential changes in there. You've got to know what this is going to cost. And like I said, it may be a great idea, but it may cost a fortune. It will never get adopted. Like we knew with the cow vaccine, it had to be less than $5 a dose, or it just was a no-go. So you got to do the cost-benefit analysis of that's actually what you're asking them to do, and ideally show how some government or company or whatever would save a lot of money doing it. You got to know the competition. Food radiation versus cow vaccine, et cetera, as an example. So you've got to know the competing areas. Really, you've got to put forward a very compelling case, and it has to be really compelling, even more compelling initially you might think it has to be to push it over the edge to actually get things happening. Finally, to finish it up, you've got to be in it for the long haul. This is going to take a long time, and there's going to be setbacks, but you have to, try and get over them. And it can often take, 10 plus years from when it's so obvious it should be implemented to when it is. And much like drug development, et cetera, it takes a long time. So with that, I think we're just about on time to close this off, and I think I'll turn it over to Diane or Marshall, whoever is then going to handle the questions.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Brett and Mary Claire, for that introduction to the fine art of celebrity science. You've offered us some valuable tips and cautionary tales about representing science in the media limelight and writing a research-based bestseller. It's now time to open the floor to questions from our attendees. I'm going to kick off with a question that's on my mind. It's really quite remarkable, I think, the tenacity and the perseverance and the learnings that you have shared with us today. And to think that you had 300 or so press interviews around the scientific paper and almost as many around the book, you know, you were working midnights and not sleeping too much by the sound of it. This must be stressful. And how do you manage that stress? Because you said you want to come across very confident, calm. What is the secret? Is it the preparation? Did you have speaking notes that you all shared with each other and referred to as kind of a foundation? Or how did you deal with that part of it?
Claire, I think you should answer that first.
Sure. Go ahead.
No, you should answer that, Claire.
Oh, okay. I thought you said you were going to answer. Yeah, for sure. And I think you made some really good points, Diana. Practice, especially in my case. I mean, and Brett was a lot more experienced in talking to the general public before I started this. So practice. I knew that there were interviews coming. I didn't have the questions, of course, that they were going to ask me, but I could guess which ones they were going to be. So especially for the first one, I actually flushed down my answers in a written form, and I practiced them before. And that became really useful, especially for radio interviews where I had to be there. And of course, I couldn't have my notes, and especially for TV interviews because I had done a little bit of practice before. It is stressful for sure, but it's also thrilling. I mean, as a scientist, I know in my case, this was the first and maybe, you know, the last opportunity that I will have to share my type of research with that kind of platform. So it was thrilling. It was also exciting, and so I with that I would say that I enjoy parts of that stress.
Great, Brett. Do you have anything?
And maybe
to add?
I can add a little bit to that. It gets easier the more you do it. Of course, the first one you're quite nervous for, but you actually get quite a bit better at it as you go along. And the other thing is that once you've done 2 or 3, you realize the questions are going to be pretty similar, and you sort of start to develop, you know, and actually becomes, if you're doing a lot of them, you try to remember what you said to each one because they kind of blend into each other. You know, like in the book, Let Them Eat Dirt. I mean, 9 out of 10 will start off the interview and say, well, so should our kids eat dirt? And, you know, this is going to come, and it comes a lot. And I mean, that was not the point of the book. The point of the book, of course, was allow kids to get early microbial exposure to help in all sorts of things. So you get better than that. It is time management huge, and like I say, you are going to be busy, and I don't think Claire would argue any which way about that. But on the other hand, I think Claire agrees too that it's a really important service a scientist should do. I mean, we get paid by the taxpayers to actually, you know, play in the lab, really, and I think it's our duty to translate things as they come along and let people know what their taxpayer dollars are actually finding. So I think it's a very important part of being a scientist.
Well, thank you very much. So I'm just going to summarize, I think, some key messages here. Do some brainstorming to prepare for the potential questions you might be asked in advance, and think about the answers. Practice makes perfect. The more you do it, the better you get at it. Maybe keep a list of the kind of questions you have been asked as a strategy for preparing to be asked those same questions in the future, and then managing your time well so that you are ready and relaxed and focused when you can do that. So those are terrific tips, and Marshall now indicates to me that we do have some questions from our web listeners. Marshall.
Thank you. Yes, the first, they're all written, so I'll read them out. And the first person to ask is Kriti Chandna, and the question is, could you provide a specific example of how one might redirect an irrelevant question during a media interview back to the topic?
I'll do this one, Claire, if you don't.
Yeah.
I think a good example was the Let Them Eat Dirt. So, okay, an interview asks you, so your book says that kids should eat dirt. You obviously hadn't read the book because nowhere in the book do we actually say that. So you say, well, no, you sort of jokingly say, well, you know, a good title would not be Let Them Eat the Microbes That Happen to Be Within the Dirt in the Playground. You say that, you know, the main message of the book is that there's microbes in the environment, including dirt, and it's really important for them to then, you know, be exposed to these types of microbes. And so that's how you bend it around. They will often say rather audacious things, and that's okay because you can use that as a stepping platform to bring it back around. As Claire said, you've really got to know what your key message is, and you have to treat each question as an opportunity to, put it to what your message is. I mean, politicians are absolute masters at this. Well, they're actually masters at avoiding answering the question, but they have a good way of, you'll hear the question being answered, the question then answered, and you will realize that they have taken it way away from what the actual question was. You say, well, that's a really good question, but and then you go far from it. So it happens, but usually it's not too intentional. Usually it's really, to be honest, naivety of the reporter on the subject matter, and they're just trying to get their foot in the door, and so you can help them by educating them a bit about what you're talking about, and then steer it back to your message.
Yeah, and I would only add to that, like Brett saying, it's really important to set the message straight. So in a way, those questions that are not necessarily well directed or not well framed are a great opportunity to do that. And you could just say, in the case of the Let Them Eat Dirt, like, yeah, we get asked that question quite a bit. We have to encourage people to go beyond the title of the book. This is not the message of the book, and then continue. So you can actually use that and almost leverage those questions to set the message straight.
Okay, thank you. Next question comes from Janet Bang, who asks, do you have advice on how to balance allocating time to knowledge translation activities and your own research and academic responsibilities?
Well, Claire, maybe you should start that as a, you want me to do that first?
Yeah, well, sure.
Okay, as a senior person, I don't have to be chained to the bench and doing actual experiments. So it's probably easier for me than a young investigator, and I see it as part of my job. But I'm sure the lab will admit that, when these things are happening, that they don't see a lot of me. And the other thing they get really tired of is TV cameras coming into the lab and setting up, oh, we won't be in the way on us. And they set up in the middle of the lab, turn the lights out, tell no one to come into the lab. And they want these, frame shots. So it is disruptive on the lab. And I tell the lab, well, guys, it's important to do this. You can see yourself on the national. And it's also important to show that, scientists just aren't geeks who wear white coats. We're actually doing something useful. And so balance is tricky, and it all gets back, just like everything in science, to time management. But on the other hand, I think if you're successful in getting message out, you're even actually helping other scientists, improving the environment for realizing science funding is actually useful, and you get the good things out of it. And I'm sure as scientists, like everyone else, we watch the news, and I don't know, I quite enjoy watching, the National, if there's some person explaining one of their interesting findings. I may not have seen that paper or found out about it. So I just see it as part of it, and you do have to balance it. But I think if you're a younger person, I'll let Claire handle that. I think it's even trickier.
Yeah, for sure, and I was going to address exactly that. I mean, I wish I could say that it's easy, and that in a 8 or 9 or 10 hour working day you'll be able to do both. But if you're on the bench, or if you're just you have to get your job done, and on top of that you may have interviews, or you may have a speaking engagement, it usually never falls in your schedule in a way that you can easily divide your time up. You're usually doing this on top of what your ongoing duties are. I mean, papers also need to get published, and work needs to get done, and you still need to attend your meetings if you want to pursue your career. The way I see knowledge translation is something that, at least in my experience, I have done in addition to the work that is required. So it is busy, but it's terribly necessary, and it is very satisfactory as well. So I would do it all over again.
Great, thank you. Next question is from Michelle Harkness, who asks, which media outlets do you feel had the greatest impact on getting your message out to a large audience?
Well, we were fortunate with the book. We had a very good U.S. agent, so we actually were even on Good Morning America. But I think I'll talk traditional press, and Claire can talk social media. In traditional press, it's the big journals that, BBC, the Times, the Guardian, the Wall Street Journal, NPR, PBS. The sound bites on local radio stations I don't think get so much press. It's the big ones that NPR, for example, where you have like an hour-long interview that goes nationally. Those have major impacts on it. You actually see bumps in sales immediately following those things. There's major bump in sale after I did the current with Anna Maria Tremonti. There was huge interest. I think all of Canada must listen to that program. And so it's the bigger ones that have, it's directly proportional to the size of the media outlet how much message gets out. Claire, you want to tackle social media?
Yeah, for social media, and it's very linked to what you were saying. I mean, you have your social media accounts, or hopefully your topic-specific media accounts. You really want to work on any interview that has been done of you, and of course, the bigger the better. And link either their Facebook page, if it was, CBC with Anna Maria Tremonti's program, or a BBC News, or The Guardian, or whatever, and link it to that everywhere, and share it as much as you can. But yeah, the bigger the outlet, the better.
Great, thank you. Next is a question from Josephine Lim, who asks, how would you suggest making basic neuroscience research interesting to media or lay audience?
Well, maybe I'll take a stab at that, Claire, first. I mean, if it was me standing in front of a reporter, I had this basic neuroscience research, I would, immediately say, well, there's X number of neurons in your brain, and these things are all firing as you're interviewing me. And the brain is really this untapped. We really don't understand how the brain works yet. And just like everything, you need to understand how things work before you can do anything about it. And then I would sort of twist the message around that how important it is to understand how basically the brain works, because that is then going to allow us to then work with it and ideally repair it or fix it. And I would try and use an analogy like a car. If you're staring at the outside of a car and you have no idea how it works and it won't start, you're done. Yet, if you actually understand how the engine works and the drivetrain works and everything, you can then go in and start to probe it. But you can't do that unless you understand in the first place. So I think there still is a lot of room for convincing people that you need to understand things before you can actually do something with it. And I think as a society, we tend to be in a haste, and then we say, well, Alzheimer's is such a big problem, we have to fix it. Well, we don't quite fully understand it yet, so how are we going to do that? And the first step is, of course, understanding it. So I would twist it that way to convince them how important this really is.
Yeah, and I would add, well, that was brilliant, just doing that in an improv fashion, Brett. But yeah, there's a method to this, and I've been researching a little bit more on that, on how to make a message that is complicated relevant. And this all dwells in the realms of science communication. There's great free available tutorials or information on science communication, but there's also great resources on courses as well. Beakerhead is a great Canadian-based outlet that teaches some of these courses, and then you can attend workshops on that. But it all has to do with simplifying, learn ways and strategies to simplify the message and make it relevant to the person that is listening to it.
Very good, thanks. Next, we have a question from Valerie Graham-Maison, who asks, what kind of visual material did you find the most useful in sharing your message with the public?
I would say, if I can... Oh, go ahead.
Claire. No, Claire.
Okay. I'll go. I would say the simpler, the better. So definitely, forget about science ways of communicating either data or messages in the form of graphs. That's completely out of the questions. Infographics are great. A single picture is great. I find that people responded really well to the art design of our book cover. It's super simple, but the combination of the phrase "let them eat dirt" with bacteria made people to ask us questions just with that simple message. Trying to summarize the messages of the book into an infographic was a great effort, especially artistically, but it's been really, really well received. So I would say avoid science, avoid data, and just keep it simple. And use a professional artist to do that if you can, unless you're very, very artistically inclined.
Yeah, I would say to add to that, I mean, you're right, Claire, simpler is better. lose the PowerPoints. You're not going to stand up and show your fax plots or whatever. And frankly, I think the most powerful tool I have is I don't use anything. I use my hands, and I try and think of analogies that I can actually explain in common sense terms that really don't require any major images or any kind of complex graphs. Presenting graphs and things to the public immediately turns them off. You want to keep it simple. You want to keep it so that you can actually explain, how something works, and just really very, as Claire said, the simpler the better, because it makes comprehension of message so much easier.
Very good, thank you. That's it for the current questions from the audience. So Diana, I'll turn it back to you.
Terrific, thank you. Brett and Mary Claire, at AllerGen we work with a lot of scientists who aren't that experienced necessarily, and also they're trainees, and they're not necessarily experienced writing for a lay audience or doing media interviews, and there's some resistance to what they perceive to be dumbing down their results, and they don't want to have to translate it into that lay concepts, those lay analogies that you've identified. Have you did you experience that yourself? Your first instinct to be completely true to the scientific evidence that you spent many years discovering? How would you convince someone who is sitting across from you with those kinds of reservations about engaging in this kind of activity? How did you find that you kept the scientific integrity and yet came up with those lay messages that were memorable and portable and meaningful?
Well, if I can start first, I would say, well, that's a great question. And I also think there's an art or even a method to that. Staying true to the science behind it is as important as carrying the message to everyone in a way that everyone can understand. I mean, if you start changing your message and moving it away to the truth that you just found through your research, that's really going to affect your credibility as a researcher. And of course, any other possible opportunity to taking it to the public audience. So I think you can do both, and you have to be careful. One of the ways that you can do that is, of course, making it available, and some of the techniques that Brett just showed in his example with brain science would be applicable here. But at the end, it's really important to say we do not know the whole story. We haven't considered this and other possibility also in a message that anyone can understand. I think that's one of the things that we do in common practice as scientists, and consider other possibilities in order to disprove a hypothesis. So you can definitely use the same method with the general public. And in fact, some people said of our book, well, you guys kept saying that you don't know the whole story. You guys kept saying that other things were possible, and that's part of the realities of in this case writing a book that is research-based. You have to take those into account.
Brett,
yeah, it's a tough line to walk. Yeah, it's a very tough line to walk, and I think initially in graduate school you start out presenting your data to other scientists, and you stay very true to the science, and you're talking to specialists. But when I took my job, I realized I didn't have a clue how to talk to the media, and I actually took training courses on exactly that, like how do you do this, and thought a lot about it. I think you start small. You start, initial smaller public talks, just, at that little kid's school, or as Claire suggested, or there's lots of local university and just, local radio stations that would love to, just sit down and chat about your work, and you can start to figure this out. I strongly believe it's an important part of being a scientist, because if you only talk to specialists, that's the only people who are going to hear about your work, and the average person does not read Science or Nature, let alone, Journal of Neurosciences, for example, and you're not going to get messages out, and I think that's bad, because I think we have to convince the world that every day we open up more in our knowledge, and this is what the scientific process is doing, and this is ideally improving our world. Otherwise, I think that, people say, well, why should we fund science? They never talk to us. They sit in their ivory tower, and they never actually, they don't interface with our world, and they will see you as strange and estranged, and they will have no desire to, support funding for science. So I think it's a process. You have to ease yourself into it. You can't jump in the deep end and educate yourself. But I think if you would like other people, other than your peers and colleagues, to understand what you're doing, you do need to think about branching out in terms of your public outreach.
Excellent, thank you. So the takeaways there are good science communicators are not born, they're made through professional commitment to acquiring those skills. And a good strategy is to start small and work your way up and practice, practice, practice by the sound of it.
That's right.
Marshall, are there any additional questions?
Yes, one more question has come in. I think to some extent you've addressed the core purpose of the question, but I'll read it nonetheless in case you have something to add. The question comes from Nina Lantinga, who asks, how would you recommend creating an incentive for scientists to contribute their knowledge and write research summaries and other types of content to be used on a website dedicated to parents and clinicians?
Well, I would say in terms of incentives, I don't know of any that are working right now that I can think of. I do know that the people that usually run and operate these sources, whether there's blogs or magazines, they're usually pretty open to well-intentioned email that outlines exactly what your message is. And many of them, especially blogs, the smaller ones, they are constantly looking for people to contribute in the form of a small summary. So I know that they're usually well received, even if you just do it by yourself, not through an agent. And I've experienced that. I don't know if you can think of anything else, Brett.
Well, one thing I would say is when we wrote Let Them Eat Dirt, Claire built a really excellent website, and on there, like one of the questions we always get is, well, what about probiotics? And it's as most people know, that's a rather complex question, and there's actually some really nice summary study out evaluating all the clinical efficacies of potential probiotics, and so now we can just refer them to that. And we've also posted all the the lectures and the press that around this, and this is turning into actually a very useful public resource. So I don't know if you need incentives to do it. I mean, the incentive should be that, well, let's get the word out. We're finding neat things. People should know about this. I'm sure even AllerGen has a public face that could be used to promote, work with an allergen, and they do it quite extensively. So I'm not sure you need incentive. I think as a scientist, why are you doing science? It's not just so you can learn something and not tell anyone else. It's most scientists are, ideological, and they would like to actually improve the world we live in, and this is a way of doing it. If you figure out a way to improve it, you might as well tell people about it. Otherwise, there's no point in doing it.
Marshall, are there any additional questions from our webinar audience?
That covers it for the moment. There are some expressions of gratitude, I should let you know, but no other questions at the moment.
Do we have time for one more short question?
I would think so. We've got about 9 minutes.
Perfect. So, Brett and Marie-Claire, you alluded to, in responding to some earlier questions, that, just look at the politicians. They're masters of redirecting questions to what the message is that they want to get out, regardless of what is asked. When you were preparing yourselves for the media onslaught that you experienced, were there particular people, whether they were scientists or news figures or public figures, that you watched with respect and learned from all the good strategies that you've identified and developed yourself? Were there people, or were there particular models, whether you found them in books or whatever, that really helped you in terms of telling you what it should look like to be effective in this domain area, or showed you what it looked like to be effective?
Well, the one that comes to mind, Diana, was actually a book that I read to prepare for TEDx talk that I was invited to do, and it's the book on, I think it's called TEDx Talks, and it's of course applicable for a 20 or 30-minute talk, but it really is about how to spell your message out. And that was a great resource. And I would strongly recommend that book. I think that I learned a lot from that book.
Yeah, I read it too, and I thought it was a terrific book. And Claire's right, that's a great place to start. And then, I mean, we all watch the news and we all pay attention. I mean, next time you watch the news, figure out who's presenting their point well and who isn't, and look at what they're doing and why are they doing it. The web is full of resources on this, and you don't have to be a Winston Churchill orator to get your message across, but I think you will see, if you see a scientist and they're, like I said, they're reading their abstract in front of the TV, you're going to turn off as well. And so, okay, well, that's one lesson. So it's acquired life of lessons that, as the more you do it, the better you get it. And you also start to realize, well, there's a neat trick, or you'll hear a really good speaker say, oh, why was that a good speaker? Oh, this is what they did, for example. And so it's a skill that you keep honing, and you will always keep honing as long as you're in this business. But I think it's a skill well worth developing.
Well, it's now approaching 2 p.m., and I would like to thank Brett and Marie-Claire for this extremely informative session. Thanks also to all of our webinar participants for attending and for your thoughtful questions and contributions to the discussion.